Solving the power dilemma, EV load management, microgrids, smart metering, and more.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I have a really excellent group of folks here willing to talk to you at depth around what's going on with the power supply crisis, making sure that we have the energy to supply all of the chargers that we're going to be putting out there, as you well know. So just a quick word about my background. Again, I'm Thor Hinckley. My background is in utility work, so I ran the renewable energy program at Portland General Electric. I did that for 25 years ago, and I remember when solar and wind were novelties, okay? And then I got involved in electric cars at about 2010, and a new novelty, right? So first you had renewables, a novelty. Then we had this thing called EVs, another novelty. Like, is it gonna make it? Is it gonna last? Well, so here we are. Solar is the cheapest form of energy out there, and EVs are rapidly approaching this inflection point where, new car sales and EVs are going to be. What I should say is we're approaching the beginning of peak oil, and we're going to see internal combustion engines really drop off. But what we really need to solve is making sure that there's enough adequate power supply to all of the chargers that are going to be out there, and that we have the means to solve the dilemma, manage the loads, and work and get microgrids and distributed energy generation resources all integrated into an ecosystem that works together, right? Because if it doesn't work together, then why are we doing this? So I'm going to let my panel give a brief introduction of each of the members of the panel give a brief introduction of themselves, and then we'll get started in the program. So Ann, do you want to go?
Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ann Yu. I'm from Customized Energy Solutions, CES. We are a services and consulting company. We really come from the wholesale side of things. We schedule over 16 gigawatt of generating resources around the country. And the reason why I'm here is that we are helping many different clients and customers looking into how do they aggregate their EV charging stations to participate in the wholesale market. So it's really coming from sort of understanding, the wholesale rules and how do you aggregate everything from behind the meter and then trying to sell them and then become part of the solution in the wholesale market. Thank you.
My name is Eli Meyer. I'm a product manager at PowerFlex. We specialize in solar storage EV charging projects co-optimized with software. So co-optimization and load management are our bread and butter. So it brings me here today.
Hey there, everybody. Ryan Galentine. I'm the policy director for electrifying transportation at Advanced Energy United. We are a multi-technology trade association, business association, working on policy, both legislative and regulatory, across the country. I work specifically in about 13 states, advancing EV policy across the country. So, good to be here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zach Woogan. I'm the Senior Policy Manager with the Vehicle Grid Integration Council. We are a national member-based association working to advance flexible charging and discharging solutions and other vehicle grid integration technologies. And I think I need a new headshot.
Good afternoon. My name's Stan Young. I'm with National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and I lead a team that takes a look at research topics at the intersection of mobility, innovation, and equity.
Well, thanks, everybody. I'm really honored to be in front of or be representing a group of really certified smart people. So I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. And I wanted to jump in on something that we heard in one of the panelists at the keynote was supply chain issues. Okay, so how are we going to deal with the increasing level 2 and level DC fast charging in light of the supply chain issues, and what kind of barriers is that presenting to you as you go about your business or the work that your organization does?
Sure. So I could start here. So we do help many different clients kind of looking into this, and the supply chain issue we're talking about, is both for the utility side in terms of building more transmission and distribution, and also from the sort of EV side or also stationary storage side in terms of getting more batteries in. So I would say it really depends on where the money is. So again, an example of EV and stationary storage. So I've been working in the stationary storage space for about 10 years now. And it's really coming about, we're piggybacking. We used to be piggybacking on the EV batteries, and it's whatever we get left over from the EV battery manufacturing, that's what we put in the stationary storage. And now it's really, with IRA, with all these incentives that's coming on right now, we're seeing a lot more manufacturing both domestically, internationally, and really trying to figure out, how do we meet that demand. So I would say it's really where the money is. And then the other point that I wanted to make is also on the utility T&D side of things, it's sort of shifting away from that centralized model. Are we thinking about distributed model in terms of supplying the energy locally and then being able to store it and then supply to the EV or use locally. So instead of trying to take time and money to build that transmission build out, it's really about figuring out if there's a new way we can think about this and supply the energy locally. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We've seen something very similar, and it's painful, but necessity is the mother of invention. So as a functionally hardware agnostic services provider, we've been able to see a lot of manufacturers take up the mantle and have to work with a lot of new partners. And so it has been hard, and it's going to continue to be hard, but we're seeing a lot more players, a lot more folks enter the field, and a lot of people try to tackle these problems. So we're optimistic. It means there's more innovation in the field, but it doesn't help the material constraints.
So, my perspective on this is, as a trade association, it's probably emerging as one of the biggest concerns that I hear from my members. Some of these delays that we're seeing, and I think as I talk to policymakers in the states, I think there's a big mismatch between what politicians, maybe even the general public, thinks about the speed of the deployment of these federal incentives and when we're actually going to get NEVI stations up and running here. And I think it's a big risk, both from EV adoption perspective and then also just a political risk for the folks that are trying to advance it. And I think the bottom line is that we need utility business model reform. The way that we've done electricity deployment doesn't match the speed of our industry and what we're trying to do and the speed that we're trying to adopt it. We're working on a bill with National Grid and some others in New York State right now to reform that business model. Agencies in the state are going to get together, decide what are the highest priority spots, and then the utilities in the state will, basically be authorized to start building now. So NEVI sites, ports, distribution facilities, just basically no regret sites that we know are going to need to be do it. So it's a flip sort of the normal order of things, but I think it's really important that we start thinking about how utilities work and how they're putting things into the rate base in a much more aggressive way. So I think that's how you solve part of it.
Yeah, and sort of to piggyback on that, this morning during the keynote, Vic from BP Pulse made a comment about how we're going to need, I think it was 1 trillion kilowatt hours of new generation for the coming EV revolution. And I think what's really important is recognizing that might not all be at the same time. We might be able to spread out and take advantage of some of these long dwell sites to unlock some flexibility from EV charging. So in the case of supply chain constraints, is the utility planning assumption that if you're installing 10 chargers, all 10 chargers will be operating at the same time, and therefore you need a new transformer and you have to wait a year for that because of supply chain constraints? Or is there some more dynamic assessment of load that can happen where you say we can actually use power sharing and load management software or a hardware-based solution like what FreeWire is offering to mitigate or avoid or defer that transformer upgrade need and make those 10 chargers operate as if they are 8 or 6. So that's one of the, I think, key challenges or key opportunities to overcome the supply chain challenge without actually targeting the supply chain challenge. And I think another one when it comes to bidirectional charging, which it's still a little bit early on, but solutions out there like Ford and Sunrun their backup power solution, are there appropriate frameworks being applied for those as well? Or are they being sort of kicked into certain interconnection frameworks where it's triggering upgrades that in reality, if it's just being used for backup power, it may not actually need to trigger those utility set upgrades. So, this is a bit long-winded, but it's really about the utility planning and interconnection frameworks and maybe shifting that paradigm and recognizing some of the flexibility that these solutions can provide.
Well, you guys are all worried about the hardware supply chain. Recent article, if you want any electrical work done, a lot of the electricians have a 6-month lag. So as soon as you solve that hardware supply chain, the trained technicians to get it in place may come to bear. And we see that as a great opportunity for some training opportunities to address equity.
Yeah, thanks, Stan. I think that's a very important piece. Is not only is the hardware in short supply, the people installing the hardware are in short supply. So, I think this is going to be one of the bigger challenges we look at. So, as we see with all of these, plans, the NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan, and other installations of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, we're going to be needing a lot more load, and this is going to drive an increased need to provide generation and storage closer to load, right? I mean, that's not surprising. Got to have either the generation there or you got to have some storage system there so that you can supply, especially for DC fast. And so now all of this comes at the same time as we're seeing this increased amount of distributed energy resources of other types, right? There's solar, there's demand response, there's all of these different technologies that start being really sensitive to loads. But what EVs present is significant load. I mean, this is not just cycling back and saving a kilowatt hour. This is cycling back and saving a significant amount of kilowatts. So the question here is, how do we optimize in the future? All right, it's not perhaps a question for now, but in the future, how do we optimize all of these, this storage, this generation closer to the load for electric vehicles that we're going to be already seeing? How do we optimize that into a grid format that that strengthens the grid rather than degrades the grid? Anybody can take that.
Yeah, I can start a little bit. Co-optimization is definitely the name of the game, and making sure, to Zach's excellent point, you're utilizing the infrastructure that you have to make it go further. So you're not overbuilding battery systems, you're not overbuilding storage to compensate for this new load that we're baking into our assumption of the future. So making sure that on-site DERs play nicely with your new EVSE load is a challenging problem, but it's a solvable one. And so on-site is relatively easy. We're exclusively behind the meter, so that's a little bit more my lens. Aggregating across multiple sites is harder, but it's fundamentally the same principle. So it begins with co-location. That business model is fairly sound, and then it's about aggregating under the same principles and the same practices. And utilizing infrastructure that exists, that folks are using behind the meter, and tapping into it when needed. We're already seeing a ton of traction, at least a ton of interest, I should say, as the storage market slows down, treating EVSE as dispatchable resources, enrolling them in things like ELRP. We're seeing a lot of interest in participation in critical load or critical peak program in Canada. So they're out there. The opportunities are out there. It's just a matter of treating load as dispatchable resources. To circumvent the actual DERs that may or may not be available due to our aforementioned supply chain issues.
Thank you. Stan, I'd be really interested in hearing what you're thinking, what's going on at NREL around this.
Boy, that hits a lot of themes. I'm an old Isaac Asimov fan and the Foundation series, going from centralized to decentralized systems, and this has a lot of flavors of that. We watch and we work with airports quite closely for a lot of reasons. Number one, employer in any urban region, a huge power user, vast resources of land. And then you look at their user base. Not only do they have all the facilities, fleets, they have a CONRAC. Was down at Dallas-Fort Worth just for a tour 18, 20 months ago. and they got a call from their Conrack and said, hey, we might need some more power. We're getting a load of EV fleets down there that set off a whole lot of planning. They have an incredible diverse employment base, everywhere from high-end executives to massive amounts of blue-collar work. A lot of those live in multi-unit dwellings. Can't we use the airport to be a template of how do you provide employee charging? And then the travelers. I mean, they rival in population the employees, if not surpass it, and they have a total new, different use cycle. To riff on an old theme, it's not your new EV, it's your old grid that needs to change there.
I wanted to add on that because I was talking with Stan earlier in terms of you were asking me whether we should not use the word microgrid anymore or change to something else. I think the new sexy word is VPP, virtual power plant. So everybody's talking about it. So it's really about how do you integrate all these resources together and then being able to support the grid, but at the same time figuring out how all the resources talk with each other, and then how do they talk with the utility, and whether this is going to be a decentralized model versus what we're seeing right now. So,
Ryan, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, on the policy side of things, I was really encouraged to see the federal government recognize the value of co-locating on-site renewables and storage, or generation and storage, with the federal incentives. And I think this new CFI program, the discretionary program that they just announced last week or 2 weeks ago, I think there's a lot of opportunity on the incentive side for very creative proposals that are going to be able to stack all of those resources together. Co-locating, at an airport or even like a port. How can we put some public school bus charging at that same spot? Can we kind of merge some of these exciting programs from the Inflation Reduction Act in really creative ways? And I think it's really incumbent on cities working with industry, all of us here, to think in new ways about how we can reduce costs for all of these things by co-locating some of these things. And I'll just add finally that states that have invested state-level resources in these have a lot more flexibility in what they are able to do. So Colorado, for example, has a state-level incentive program where they're mixing their NEVI program with funding with some of their state-level program, and they're able to then kind of pick and choose, pull from different pots of money that are more flexible than others, and award grants based on that. And so to me, you're going to get a lot more efficient money for your outcomes for your public dollars by doing that. So we're a real big advocate for that in reducing costs under the system.
And I'll keep this one shorter. I think the question of how to optimize is very much touches on the technology side and how to integrate and get everything to speak with each other and with the grid. And I think it also comes down to compensation. And you mentioned ELRP, you mentioned CPP, all the fun acronyms. I think, the question is in a lot of ways for utility commissions and utilities, how are you going to optimize in terms of pricing and offer customers an opportunity to leverage these solutions? So, it's great that there's funding, but on a how do we create a sustainable marketplace? Maybe it's the FERC Order 2222 and the work CES does, bidding into the wholesale market. Maybe it's, utility rate offerings or programs like ELRP, but, it's ultimately, there's no requirement for, even after these solutions are installed, for them to act as good citizens of the grid and charge and discharge in appropriate times. But to make a VPP happen, we need those paid, maybe voluntary, maybe there's a spectrum of how committed you must be as a VPP, but there needs to be some skin in the game, some underlying compensation mechanism. And that's, I think, the answer in a lot of ways to the question of how to optimize, make it worth the while to do it.
So whether you refer to it as a virtual power plant or a microgrid, which is the way I grew up, I mean, I think that the idea here is a self-contained generation supply and distribution system that can island itself, especially in case of grid disruptions. And so now we're starting to see in the early phases of EV adoption, the facilities that have large fleets of vehicles start moving toward electrification. So we're seeing airports, military bases, all types of concentrated industrial activity, freight hubs, all move toward, and ports as well, move toward, being high demand users of electricity. So what is the role of microgrids, virtual power plants, in serving that need, in serving that load?
Can I add something? So I wanted to say I think there might be a distinction between VPP versus microgrid.
There is, there is, yes.
Yeah, because I think microgrid, you're still thinking more about being being able to isolate yourself from the grid entirely. But where VPP, again, we're using Tesla here, they were saying that their VPP, they can aggregate their, last year they aggregate like 50 megawatt of their in-home battery power walls and then try to provide through, right through the emergency load during California, when we had a really grave heat wave in September last year. So they were selling it, 50 megawatt capacity into the grid, and I think they were dispatched like 30 odd megawatt. But it's not something. So again, a fun fact: I just lost power a couple of weeks ago, and then I think during that, and I'm in the PG&E territory. I think during that power outage, many people realized that their Tesla power walls in their garage actually cannot be islanded. They have electricity inside, but they cannot use it. So it's different in terms of the islanding function. So I think in terms of question about the microgrid, I think it's more focused on the resiliency side of things rather than being aggregating it and then selling it back to the utility.
Well, maybe we need a third term between microgrid and VPP. Again, airports resiliency is nearly equal to the military. If the power's down, they're out of business. Recently in Puerto Rico and just in the rural areas, the reliability of the power grid is so bad that the local graffiti artists let the power company know what they think quite prolifically. And so something to the effect of, we have the convergence of the old grid with local storage, with the Internet of Things, and somehow economics governing and balancing all of that. I think one of the things that doesn't get enough discussion is we're always, natural disasters are coming more frequently. We know that. And there will be times of grid outage. The local power distributions need some functionality to say, what are critical functions to run off a local storage versus what are marginal functions that I can step back on? There's been some discussion in that with respect to charging, but needs more discussion on how does the local area need to get smarter to optimally use the local storage when that's the only thing that's available versus how to balance it when both local and grid power is available.
Yeah, and just to tack onto that, I think there's some really fundamental questions around what we as a society or regulators are going to allow microgrid to be or be defined as. So if you are islanding from the grid, if you're an individual location, that is maybe covered under the current sort of regulatory scheme we have in place. But if you're trying to cross the street or stitch together a number of homes or campuses or airports, do you suddenly become a utility or a micro utility, and what are the legal implications of that for the existing utilities? So you mentioned, utility business model reform, and this is really at the heart of that. And it is also not unique to EVs or VGI or grid integration of vehicles, but for all distributed energy resources, it's this common theme.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that electric vehicles, much like solar, are going to continue to pressure the existing utility model, and eventually drive some significant changes. It's already happening if you're keeping track of what's going on with net metering across the country. And electric vehicles are going to be, as we switch to from liquid fuels to electricity in all of these vehicles, you're going to see significant changes in the utility model, business model, because it was never developed for the kind of volume and continuous growth that we're going to see now as transportation becomes electrified. Any other comments from the panel on that?
I would just add a little bit of additional flavor. So I totally agree on the resiliency piece. Something that we've been, I guess I'll say, optimistic about is you're talking about energy delivery, times of crisis or safety. We've also seen microgrids serve as an opportunity for additional power generation when you don't need that backup energy. So supplementing EV chargers, passing through the solar, and I mean, it really is supplementing EV chargers so that, again, you can do more with less. You can utilize that additional kind of manufactured load, even though you're not sizing the feeder to that system for all 50 of your EV chargers. We also love big station deployments. You're not sizing for those 50, you're sizing the microgrid feeder for those 50. So we're seeing additional opportunities in the power generation, not just the energy delivery side as well.
So I think embedded in a lot of what we're hearing too is this idea now. So what about the electric vehicle manufacturers? What's their role in this emerging grid ecosystem? Are they just going to be transportation providers? I don't think so. I think we're starting to see, and I know from my experience working with car manufacturers like Nissan and Chevy and Ford, that now they're actually in the energy business. You know, they started out making vehicles. They think of themselves as vehicle manufacturers, but what's happening is they're creeping and they're entering into this energy sector, and some of them are being dragged into it. And for example, I know Elon Musk is not a big fan of vehicle to grid. He doesn't think it's going to be a big sector, but I think there's a lot of people, forward-thinking people, that feel like this could be the breakthrough innovation, especially as we look to increase the need to increase resiliency, right? I live in Oregon. Parts of northern Oregon, parts of northern California, parts of southern Washington have increased fire risk as time goes on, and they're going to need people. They're going to shut off the utilities. Are going to shut off the power to avoid huge lawsuits. And how are these people going to supply their homes and their small businesses with the energy they need if the power shut off for a week for a dry spell? So could you guys speak a bit to the role of OEMs in this emerging ecosystem of grid integration and energy storage?
I might start with this one. VGIC represents several of the large OEMs. And what I can say is there's immense interest, as you noted. There's, GM has launched GM Energy, and I think the thing to note, and you hinted at this with all the, ways in which EVs can serve as distributed energy resources or energy assets. There's a full spectrum of capability, from flexible unidirectional charging through backup power through full vehicle to grid, and then there's also a spectrum of participation. And I think what's really important to recognize is we don't necessarily need 100% of drivers or fleets to be interacting with the grid in the same way, right? There's a spectrum of opportunity to support the grid, and every customer is going to have their own relationship with their OEM and with the utility and the other stakeholders along the way. The other thing I'll mention is that it's pretty apparent that the OEMs have been, and the charging manufacturers and the software providers, everyone kind of needs each other. I don't think this can be done in a vacuum with one slice of the industry. So I think events like this and other convenings or groups that can bring together all the different stakeholders and try to work toward a solution is really critical to moving forward on this front.
Yeah, I would just love to build on that. I would just point to, for example, Ford's partnership with Sunrun. It's a great example of how this stuff is very marketable, very, very exciting for a lot of end users who might not otherwise be able to think about this in that way. And it also just kind of goes to show, where you're talking about automakers getting into the energy game, the energy game's getting into the auto game too. So we're really seeing that these really are, big batteries on wheels. And when you think about what the capabilities are of having, a fully dispatchable, gigantic potential load that you could move anywhere around the grid in ways that could be hugely beneficial for resiliency, for overall cost of upgrades on the distribution system, it's really exciting. I guess I'll finish that.
One thing I wanted to add is that when we're talking to OEM clients, when we point out, these are the different services that you can also do, providing the grid, one question I get a lot more is that, so how do we design our battery in a way that because that's not what they're thinking when they're packaging these batteries. They're thinking about, you're going to use them as a driving vehicle, and then, at the end of the day, if it's like 30% charging, you're going to charge it back to 100%. So the usage profile is completely different when you're trying to participate in the grid, and I think that's a big factor when, the car manufacturers are thinking about this, and they're thinking about, okay, how do I manage my battery? And then it might also depend on how comfortable the consumer is, right, for letting the others use my battery. And I think the flip side of that is when the consumers are actually getting incentives from participating in these programs, are they big enough? So if you participate in the California ELRP program, you might get $60 out of a couple of hour events. Is that big enough an incentive for me to provide, use my Tesla battery and then try to sell it back to the grid? Is that do I want to get that $60 and then maybe some shorter life on my battery? Am I okay with that? So I think those are kind of additional things that we're not as the OEM and as the consumers that we have to think through.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to realize that there's a couple of charging protocols that have been around that are competing in the marketplace, and CHAdeMO is one, and CCS, and essentially CCS is winning and has won. I think I can declare that the winner, at least in today's world. But CHAdeMO, which was really designed in Japan, was functionally designed to provide vehicle-to-grid integration, and a lot of the driving force there was the Fukushima disaster in I think it was 2011. Yeah, and so it was very interesting to realize that this was like one of the early thoughts, as they had this huge disaster. They had nuclear plants that went out, and Nissan was trying to respond and realized that they had a protocol that was very, very useful in providing energy into a grid that was disabled because of the tidal wave. So and then also just recently, last year, Nissan made it clear that you could use the batteries in your Nissan Leaf to do vehicle to grid work. Before that, the assumption was that no, you would void the warranty on your electric vehicle if you started using the battery for anything other than the traction and moving the vehicle. And so there's been this evolution, and we're going to continue to see this kind of evolution as these new technologies interact with the existing structures of the utility model. And I, for one, am hoping, and I think Ryan will probably agree with me on this, is that that we start to see the cracks and the fissures emerge, and we get a new energy system that can serve these new technologies in a clean and equitable way. So, thank you. Yeah, I think that's one of the promises that electrification holds out. So you're not going to see me as anything as a big fan of, other than folks like Rewiring America, because I think this idea of electrification of everything is going to be the most biggest economic driver and the biggest force for equity and equality that we have in our energy world. So I wanted to ask a little bit more of a technical question here, and hopefully you guys agree with me that, so how can we improve communications between vehicles so that right now we have this, this kind of lack of connection between the utility and what's going to be the load, right? I mean, the load at many charging stations, DC fast chargers, is still waiting to appear, right? There's still not much traffic, and I know there's a lot of large, I won't mention any names, but there's charging providers out there that are still waiting for their business model to be profitable. And so the load, it's quite matching up where the load's coming, when the load's going to be there and how they're going to serve it. And so it's very intermittent, right? So how do we solve the intermittency problem with EV loads by increased communication?
Well, I'll say briefly on communications generally and getting everything to speak with one another. I think it's important to recognize that we can get a lot done without a perfect world of full interoperability and cloud communications or whatever pathway is preferred. So for example, we've talked a lot about ELRP, California's Emergency Load Reduction Program. That's an email notification that's sent out to aggregators from the utility to trigger an event. There's also an open ADR signal that's sent out as a courtesy. It's not the official signal, but it just goes to show that there's a lot we can do today with what would maybe seem very rudimentary or basic communications pathways. But I don't want to overlook, because I think it's really tempting to fall into, oh, everything doesn't talk to each other, how far can we really get? And there's some truth to that. To scale to a very large marketplace, we're going to need more interoperability and communications protocols that work with one another. But I just want to pause there for a moment and recognize there's a lot being done and a lot that can be done in the interim while some really smart people are trying to figure out how to get everything to talk to one another.
Any other thoughts?
That opens it up to a lot of things. I've been chasing vehicle communications for vehicle safety and efficiency, and then turning it over, how do we do it for charging? We got several worlds colliding on each other. And in this space, if you have flexibility in charging, it gives you something to trade for resiliency on the grid. I mean, our fleets, at airports, those rental car fleets and the airport fleets, they don't have that flexibility. They need it when they need it. But you have vast amounts of travelers and vast amounts of employees that have at least an 8-hour window in order to get it. That's where that communications, that's where that management and control structure needs to come in to trade them off as appropriately and move that forward.
I wanted to make sure we asked the bottom line question here before we got too far into this discussion. Is so the business case for EV charging is not yet closed. It's not yet clear. It's not yet decided. There's no. This is an incentive-driven sector of the economy, much like renewables used to be when I was in it. Right? If there weren't incentives, people wouldn't be doing it. And so here we are. So, absent the long-term the long-term government subsidies and incentives, how can electrification proponents, and I think we're all here representing electrification, how can we make how can we see continued investments in electric vehicle charging systems, and to make them a more profitable undertaking, right? How can we move into the new world of beyond subsidies? Solar made it, wind made it. What's it going to take for electric vehicles?
If I can start. So we recently did an analysis on the PG&E pilot rate that they are going to peg the EV charging rate to the wholesale market rate, and then also have some sort of incentive on the side as well. But just based on what we looked at, if we compare that with sort of existing time of use EV rate, it's a huge difference in terms of charging cost. So if you switch from your existing time of use rate to their hourly varying rate, and then try to manage your charging accordingly, the cost saving is enormous. Just looking at that, and this is not even about V2G. It's not about integrating and selling back to the grid. This is just about reducing your bill. This is about how do you make sure that you're charging more efficiently based on the wholesale market pricing. And of course, the fleet that we're analyzing was a commercial fleet, so it's much easier to know when it's going to be charging and when it's on the road. Versus when you have a public charger, it's completely different. Of course, the PG&E pilot rate right now is mostly focused on commercial EVs and school buses, where the charging, the timing is much more predictable. But I think just by looking at that and understanding, this huge potential here, and I think it's really up to the utilities to come up with these type of rates that would incentivize people to charge at the right time. Especially, starting from the commercial fleet, starting from the school bus fleet, where we know it's much more predictable than anything else. So I think that's where we can gradually take away the subsidies and really show people this is how you're saving so much on your charging costs, and therefore this is worth doing it.
I think I may have a slightly different answer from all y'all on the policy side. we're very fortunate on the EV charging side that every driver becomes an ally in the battle of this kind of cultural war towards shifting the way we think about fueling vehicles. So, not a culture
war.
No,
Everybody's on the same page.
lowercase. But it's a slow and long cultural change about I want to fuel differently from the way that I'm used to. We're very fortunate that we have so many allies in this. Solar is a tough business. There's still a lot of incentives for solar. It's a very low margin, expensive, long process. EV drivers are starting to expect that wherever they go, there is a charger. And so we have allies, especially on the C&I side and on the fleet side, that wherever you go, there's going to be a charger. So it creates an additional forcing function beyond the financial measures of consumer expectation, participant expectation, and allies in this endeavor to electrify transportation.
I mean, I think it's easy to get caught up when we're in the details of this to forget that what we're trying to do is like fundamentally save the future of humanity by reducing emissions from the transportation sector. I think because of that, policymakers are going to continue to be very interested in the success of this industry. It's actually, in my opinion, vital for the future of our species. But I do think that, the policies that have been in place, Advanced Clean Cars, the ZEV states that have adopted full electrification by 2035 using the California's Clean Air Act, that's really we're starting to see market transformation. I mean, the OEMs it's a pretty clear thing. You want to sell vehicles in this set of states, like one in five Americans, I think more than that, 2 in 5 Americans live in a state that's adopted this. So on the incentive side, I think states are going to continue to invest in it because of that. We need to focus the incentives on market transformation rather than wholesale compensation for it. And if your business is focused on, building your margins based on those incentives, you're probably going to eventually run into trouble. That's not to say that on the whole, people will continue to be supportive of and continuing to invest public money into these new innovations. I also think, the idea of that is to scale, find things that really work, battery technology, things that drive down the cost of everything. And I would finally say, if your company isn't involved at the PUC and the states and the markets that you're involved in, you go to a conference like NARUC, and it's a lot of energy regulators. They're talking about our industry, but we're not there. You look at the attendee list of that, it's very different than the attendee list of this conference. And so if I could leave you with any piece of advice, we're working on that, but I really encourage your businesses to engage in those conversations. In most states, it's a public process. You can get engaged in it, and if you don't have anybody representing you on that policy front, you might not have a business forever. So.
Okay.
I couldn't agree more. It's a mud fight. It's where it's all happening, and where the rules of the market are made. And to a certain extent, not to throw utilities under the electric bus, but it is, they are to a certain extent gatekeepers of the marketplace, and their gatekeepers are their regulators. And so if you're not playing in that space alongside Ryan and I and others, then you might not be able to build a business model because you can't read the tea leaves or understand how the market is evolving. And if you can't do that, you definitely can't influence the evolution of the market to fit what you have as a solution. So, and then I'd say just a separate note, but to the same question, in the interim, while utilization rates maybe are low for something like a DC fast charger, that's when this multi-DER or VPP or microgrid, putting a battery there is a great way to take your site control and your grid connection and put another solution there that can provide value to the grid when there's no charging going on.
Let me check real quick. So is everybody comfortable with these? We're throwing out a lot of acronyms, and I'm not sure, and I like what you just said, Zach, but distributed energy resources and virtual power plants, so DERs are distributed energy resources, which are arguably electric vehicles are one and solar panels are another. And VPP, virtual power plants, is when you aggregate that energy and then can provide significant amounts of energy to the grid when it's in stress. So I just wanted to make sure we're not throwing out too many acronyms, but Stan.
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be an economist, so I'll go back to behavioral analytics. got stuck in between an argument between two national leaders, one on centralized power and one on distributed power. It was an education, to say the least. Within the last 12 months, we crested the takeoff stage for EV adoption, 5%, which means we're going from market push to market pull. I still have faith in the capitalistic system that once we get to market pull, there'll be enough initiative there in order to tackle some of these issues.
Thank you. So let's do a thought exercise similar to what they did at the keynote, and let's move out 5 years, right? And so we're in 2028, right? And so by now there's gigawatts of energy out there driving around all over the highways, parked at retail establishments, parked at residential multi-unit dwellings, parked at residential, single-family homes. And so what do we do with that? I mean, how do we start integrating that amount of energy into our current grid, which is, was only designed for one-way flow? I mean, that's a fundamental issue here, right? And it's now, as we, it used to be kind of a ancillary question, wasn't that much energy, but it's going to be gigawatts by 2028. So how do we deal with that?
I'll say, I think that we need to be not thinking of VGI or vehicle grid integration as an afterthought. I think that's like rule number one is deploying the infrastructure, deploying the vehicles, and then trying to figure out like how do we manage this load, or how do we leverage this for bidirectionality. And this gets to Ann, what you were talking about, OEMs asking about their batteries and designing their batteries. And I think Thor, you mentioned it earlier with utility planning. I think it just comes back to this point of like the infrastructure conversation cannot be separated from the conversation of how we use the infrastructure. So the rate design, the program design, the interconnection rules, these are all related to the infrastructure. So if there's an infrastructure program in your state, whether it's NEVI or a utility make-ready program, and they're not in the same conversation or the same workshop talking about rate design for those the charging rates, or program design for managing flexibility, then they're going down the wrong course, and we're going to end up probably overbuilding our grid at a minimum. That's like best case scenario, we just overbuild the grid. Worst case, we could actually cause a lot of problems and actively challenge our aging grid.
Well, I'm just going to say, I mean, we're thinking about EVs now, and basically they're batteries with enough energy to power the vehicle for a typical 1 week's worth of work. Home electrification is right around the corner. So imagine every home having the equivalent of energy storage for 5 to 7 days worth of home energy. I think a good thought exercise is project 10, 15 years into the future, saying, regardless of how technology gets us there, we are going to have energy storage in some form, well distributed. What would our energy system need to look like then, and set a future goal, and then have a discussion on how to get there?
I think it's interesting. You could look at it from both ways, and you probably need to do both. What do we need to do to get to this 2028 stage, and all of the sort of immediate, very quick things in terms of the protocols and deployment and getting these things out in the ground quickly. But then I think it's also helpful to think about what's the future state when buildings are electrified, when we have 100% EV deployment. How much do we need to do, and work backwards from there? And I think utilities are more comfortable with that side than we need to get things done quickly now. And I think you need to kind of approach this problem from both sides. It would be a real shame from just a public policy perspective if we weren't taking advantage of all of these potential values that are that could accrue to the grid from this possibility on the transmission side. But if we're being honest as an industry, we do need a lot more generation, so you can do a lot of things with rate design, load shaping, time of use rates, demand response, managed charging programs that can reduce that overall need. However, we do need to start saying, what do we need to build out, and what are the resources that we need to build? And that goes not just at a statewide level, or even a regional RTO level, ISO level, but like at a neighborhood level or at a transformer level, we really need to do that kind of foresight and analysis to figure that out.
Yeah, and that's absolutely been our focus, seeing the same thing of focusing behind the meter to help build some of that leeway and allow for greater distribution upgrades and that transformation to occur. Because 5 years is not a long time. 5 years is really, really fast, especially when you think about there is a ton of energy on the road and stored in vehicles, but a majority of that stock is going to be vehicles that don't have bidirectional capability. We're still on the cusp of that capability. And so it means it's a huge opportunity for the availability of EVs, which I love. I'm still in a plug-in hybrid myself, so I'm waiting for the cost to come down. But it means that bidirectional isn't necessarily an opportunity for that stock, so it becomes about load reduction at the point of charge.
The other thing, I mean, just added on that, I think hopefully 5 years from now, when I ask anybody on the road, they will know what time of use rate is. So it's really hard right now because I asked, where my friend, they're like, what is that? Like, why do I have to start my dishwasher at 9 p.m.? So that's what I do, yes. So I want, people to know what is time of use rate. I want people to know, like, you could actually get, cheaper charging if you try to charge it at a certain time of the day. It's just like that understanding of there are difference in terms of when you use the energy, and then there are difference in terms of how much of that would go into the bills that you're paying. I think that piece, 5 years is not a long time, but hopefully by 5 years from now, people would kind of get to understand that concept, and that's when we start get the conversation going. Yeah.
I got to jump in on that. The
Please.
consciousness of the U.S. is changing.
Yes.
10 years ago, the chat at the party was, did you see the price of gasoline? Now that the local utility company put in the time of use charge, that conversation, just small talk, is going, wow, I got to get my dishwasher late at night, or I got to get a smarter charger for my PHEV so it doesn't kick in until 9 o'clock or something like that.
Yeah, but right now, so I do review the email that I get from PG&E weekly. I saved like $2 this week versus last week, but that's all I get. Like, I care about it, so I look at it, but I don't think most people would care about saving $2 this week versus last week. So that's another aspect.
And we could do that behind the scenes, right? The providers can say, we know customers don't care on a day-to-day basis maybe, but they do want to save money. So how can an aggregator, third-party provider step in and make this behind the scenes and kind of happen automatically from a customer's perspective until the end of the year when they look, wow, I saved $500 on my charging costs or $1,000. I think that's it. EV charging is already cheaper than gas, but can we push that down even further and make it easier for you to buy an EV, right? It becomes more cost-effective, and it's just, I think there's a lot of strategies that we can talk about in maybe another panel on how to make it behind the scenes and easy.
So, for me, I think the next big challenge, and Ryan mentioned this, and I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on it, we're probably all representatives of ZEV states, zero-emission vehicle states that are really pushing electric vehicles through policy and pushing the utilities through the regulators to get involved in vehicle electrification. But there's 13, 14 ZEV states? All right. And
Light duty, yeah.
All right, so that leaves a fair amount of outliers, and then we already have states like Wyoming that have almost done anti-EV legislation, right? So, how do we take these discussions to the flyover parts of the U.S. and get them on board? Because to be quite honest, they're not on board yet.
Yeah, and I think that we're starting to see an unfortunate bifurcation of the EV haves and EV have-nots.
Yep.
And I think that really shows up in the rate design and the policy making. In Pennsylvania, not to call people out, but we've been working on a bill there for years now, trying to get the PUC there to have an EV-specific docket to look at rate design specific to EVs, because right now it's just treated like any other load. There's a couple pilots out there, but it's not permanent structures. And if you are just treating EVs as any other load on the grid, it's really not going to go well. It's going to be a lot more expensive. And the other piece on the advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks regulations, is that you're seeing automakers deliver models to those states. And in order to get a big piece of that, states need to adopt these emissions reductions. And so, like the Toyota RAV4 plug-in hybrid, you can't find that outside of California because they're only selling it in California to comply with those low carbon requirements. So, that might not be the case once we get further and further along on the electrification journey, and as automakers reach scale with this, but it is kind of driving that market forward.
Okay. Well, we got about 7 minutes left, and I wanted to throw the opportunities out to you to ask questions of this extremely qualified panel.
Check one,
and get their thoughts on your question. Anybody, questions? I've got more, but I wanted to see if the audience had any questions.
Thanks, everyone. Just a quick question. From the fleet perspective, it's very exciting to see what we could do with VPPs and managed charging and so on. But frankly, we're in the crawl stage of the crawl, walk, run effort. And sometimes the biggest challenge is just getting power to sites. So when you guys are talking about microgrids, whether they are backed up by the real grid or completely isolated, what are you guys seeing in terms of power generation technologies that you're most excited about? Because that can get pretty pricey, I think. Thank you.
So we're pretty much seeing a similar run book to a corporate and industrial site. So it's solar, it's combined solar and storage, and that storage often comes with a hefty price tag. And so that's frequently the deterrent. The journey we try to take people on is not dissimilar from that of the commercial locations of folks say, I have an EV, I know it's low, I want it charged now, I want to go home. It's a cultural shift on that individual side as well as on the fleet side. I was at ACT Expo last year, and I can't tell you the number of people who came up to me and said, hey, do you have a 500 kilowatt charger? I'm like, no, nobody does. And you don't want them. You don't want 6 500 kilowatt chargers. Think about your lead time. Think about how long those vehicles are sitting, what their dwell time is already, and utilize that time for a smaller infrastructure upgrade, a smaller deployment.
Yeah.
It's more cost effective, it's less strain on the grid, and it's going to be more economical for you ultimately. And I know that's not going to work for everyone, but that's the shift that we're trying to work towards.
Yeah, thanks. I guess a quick clarification. It's not so much about the power
So we
levels,
have-
it's about
so we-
energy.
So I'm sorry. We had some questions there in the back.
Oh, we can talk after.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Jeremiah Hartley. I'm the airport rental car manager at Portland International Airport up near your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
Zach, I'm glad you got the memo on hair today. I appreciate that. The question was asked earlier about commercial sites, essentially, and airports in particular, to Stanley's point. And we kind of got sidetracked a little bit, but we're in the midst of a long-term project to electrify. The rental car piece has been the first, like the tip of the spear, because of the necessity and how OEMs are creating more and more vehicles that then need to get charged at my new Conrack. What suggestions do you have for large commercial facilities like mine, almost 24-hour-a-day operations that don't have the flexibility of a retail, like a neighborhood or something like that, for bidirectional charging, in order to kind of adapt quickly, especially with existing infrastructure and buildings that are aging and that kind of thing?
Well, I won't have a hard response. I'll have a soft response. Again, that's why we're watching airports. You guys are on the tip of the spear. You have incredible resiliency issues as well as incredible customer demand. Are you part of a cohort with other airports, seeing what they've tried and what works well and what doesn't work well? Are you partnering? I mean, you're in the neck of the woods. I know where the DOE labs are. Making sure they're at the table and drawing as much information from what they've seen in applied applications. I'll just leave it at that because more mobility expertise than the grid expertise.
There are definitely a fair number of products that are coming out to fit that specific niche. If I understood your question correctly, so we've developed a forklift movable skid that you can put a DC fast charger on and has a basically generator connector. So if you have a generator in hookup, you're flowing the other way to that DC fast charger. It allows for quicker deployment, a lot more mobility of that. So you're not having to run conduit and do that kind of permanent install if you're just getting your feet wet. So that buys you a little bit of time to do that real due diligence, get a permit, get everything figured out, and actually do the final install. Because you need, I mean, to your point, that's a case. Rental fleets are where you do need to turn those vehicles immediately. So yeah, there's a new niche emerging for exactly that use case for folks who need something now because the EVs are here and are still on their way to their final destination. So
I got to get a plug in as far as behavioral. You got to turn all those cars around. They're not making money if they're sitting there plugged in on the charger. So that's where I see low-speed automation, which we think is mature enough, combined with the inductive charging, if it's mature enough to say, hey, can we marshal all these vehicles around in the appropriate amount of time and get as much labor out of it as possible.
So we got about a minute and a half left. We had one more question over here.
Hi, thank you. So I work with an electric utility cooperative in North Carolina.
Can you put the mic a little bit closer to your mic?
Can you guys hear me better now?
Yeah.
I work with an electric utility co-op in North Carolina. We have several EV chargers, but actually only one of them is ever profitable. I think largely because most EV owners have a charger at home, and that's where 80% of the charging is. So do you guys have any suggestions to make it more profitable for public infrastructure to be implemented rather than simply being the EV owners to save money?
Can I comment on that to begin with? I was lucky enough to interact with Columbus, Ohio, and their smart city.
Yep.
And they were trying to put in level 3 chargers, and they finally came to the conclusion it's more important for them to be visible than to be used. I don't know the economics of solving that, but knowing that those are available then opens up purchasing them to get over the running out of your battery power, even though you'll maybe never get your capital cost back out of it.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of our time here today. I want you to help me thank our panel for some wonderful advice and information. And we'll be around to the rest of the day and probably tomorrow. So, come seek us out. Have any questions? We're happy to help. Thanks.